I'm 42 years old now. Married, no kids, financially independent. I run a small consulting firm in a niche industry, the kind of thing most people don't understand when I explain it, but it pays very well. I've got a house I actually like being in, a wife who doesn't keep score over who does the dishes, and a quiet routine that makes me feel sane. On paper, I guess you could say I've made it. But every now and then, I still hear echoes of a phrase burned into me since childhood. You owe us for everything. Don't forget that. That sentence, or some variation of it, was the soundtrack of my upbringing. My parents weren't the type to say, I love you, without attaching a receipt. Everything, food, clothes, school, even just existing under their roof, was presented like a loan with interest. They reminded me, constantly, that I was a burden they had to carry, and someday I'd have to pay them back. I used to think all kids heard this, that it was normal, that maybe gratitude just meant tallying up a lifelong bill until you could finally square up with your parents. But then I'd hear other kids' parents talk about things like unconditional love, or I'd see moms smiling at their kids like it wasn't costing them anything, and I'd feel this knot in my stomach. Because in my house, nothing was free. One of my earliest memories is sitting at the kitchen table, maybe 6 years old, with my mom putting a plate of spaghetti in front of me. Before I could even touch the fork, she leaned over and said, "You know this costs money, right? Sauce, noodles, meat. Don't waste a single bite. Your father worked hard to pay for this." I nodded, guilty, as if just existing in that chair was already too expensive. It never stopped. Backpacks for school? Don't ruin it. I had to pick up extra shifts to pay for that. A winter coat? Better take care of it, because it wasn't cheap. Even toilet paper somehow became an expense they reminded me I was responsible for. The phrase they loved the most was, "Someday, you'll pay us back for all this." The worst part was, they weren't joking. I remember one night, maybe 10 years old, I had a fever and was curled up on the couch. My dad brought over some medicine, and I thought for a moment he was being kind. Then he muttered, "This bottle cost $12. Don't think we forgot. You're gonna owe us for every cent, boy." I swallowed the pill with this heavy shame, like I was racking up a debt I could never repay. And whenever I showed any spark of independence, like wanting to try a sport or join a club, they framed it as me adding to my balance. I once asked to go on a school field trip that cost $15. My mom looked at me and said, "Do you think we're made of money? Add it to your tab." She actually kept a little notebook in the kitchen drawer, scribbling down amounts. I don't know if she ever seriously tracked it all, but the act of writing it was enough. It was psychological warfare dressed as bookkeeping. Growing up in that environment, I internalized two things. Love was conditional. Survival meant I'd better figure out how to pay them back someday. That pressure ate at me every single day. I felt like a tenant in their house, not their son. And not even a good tenant. More like a freeloading squatter who was barely tolerated as long as he didn't step out of line. I can't count how many times my dad would look at me and say, "You think food is free? You think electricity just appears? When you're older, you'll understand." And then the kicker. We expect you to take care of us when we're old. That's the deal. The deal. Like my existence had been negotiated in some backroom contract I never signed. By the time I hit high school, the ledger in my head was crushing me. Every sandwich, every ride to school, every light left on in my bedroom. I calculated it all, like some doomed accountant in a rigged system. I started working part-time jobs as soon as I legally could, not because I wanted pocket money, but because I thought maybe I could start repaying early, like chipping away at some massive student loan. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. When I handed my mom $50 from my first paycheck, she smirked and said, "Drop in the bucket. You've still got 18 years worth of bills to cover." My dad laughed like it was a great joke. I laughed too, because what else could I do? Cry? It was during those years that I quietly decided, as soon as I was legally able, I'd leave. No goodbyes, no dramatics. Just gone. Because if they were going to keep treating me like a debtor, maybe the only way out was to treat them like creditors, coldly, transactionally, with nothing extra. That seed sat in my chest for years, waiting. Now, decades later, I've carried out a plan that younger me wouldn't even have believed possible. It took years of grinding, of living below my means, of studying until my eyes bled, and working jobs that made me hate the sound of an alarm clock. But I did it. And recently, I finally paid my parents back. down to the cent, exactly what they always claimed I owed. And then I cut them off forever. But before I get to that part, the revenge, the closure, I need to explain how deep their hooks went and how I clawed my way out. Because this wasn't some overnight decision. It was decades of oppression, shame, and calculation building up to a single, deliberate move. So let me start from the beginning. High school was when the weight of that debt really started to crush me. I was old enough to see how different my life looked compared to my friends. They could talk to their parents about wanting to drive, or about saving for college, or even something as simple as hanging out at the mall without it being turned into a negotiation. Meanwhile, every single request I made, whether it was for $20 to buy a yearbook or a ride to a friend's house, was met with a reminder that I was in arrears. One night, sophomore year, I came home from working a 4-hour shift at the local grocery store. I'd been bagging groceries for minimum wage, standing on my feet the whole time, smelling of dust and cabbage. I came in with about $40 in cash, proud that I'd earned it myself. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd see I was trying. My dad looked at the money in my hand and said, "That won't even cover what we spent on you this week. Gas, food, water, you're still in the red." My mom laughed and added, "Don't think we're running a charity here." I went upstairs and shut the door, holding that money in my hand like it was both a lifeline and a chain. I realized in that moment that no matter how hard I worked, they would never let me feel like I was caught up. The ledger was imaginary, sure, but the guilt it created was real enough to keep me trapped. I started to develop two separate selves. There was the version of me at school, quiet, reserved, but starting to test my independence, making friends who had no idea what was happening at home. And then there was the version at home, silent, obedient, always trying not to incur more charges against myself. I remember a specific conversation junior year. I'd gotten a B+ on a math test and wanted to show my dad because he was always on me about grades. I thought he might be proud. Instead, he glanced at the paper and said, "If you don't get scholarships, you know who's paying for college? Us. And then you'll be in debt for the rest of your life. Maybe you should think about getting straight, as if you want to lighten the load." It wasn't encouragement. It was a threat, dressed up as motivation. So I started plotting. Not in a cinematic way, with secret plans taped under floorboards, but in the slow, grinding way a teenager does when he realizes his survival depends on leaving. I researched community colleges. I looked up jobs that paid enough to cover rent, even if the rent was for a crappy studio apartment with peeling paint. I saved every dollar I could, tucking it away in an envelope that I hid in a hollowed-out textbook. At the same time, my parents ramped up the guilt. Senior year, when everyone else was talking about prom, I asked my mom if I could go. Tickets were $50. Her response, "So you want to add $50 to your tab for one silly night? Don't be selfish." My dad chimed in with, "You're already tens of thousands in debt. What's one more?" I didn't go to prom. I told my friends I just didn't care about it. In reality, I couldn't stomach the thought of owing them more. The irony is, the more they tried to make me feel indebted, the more they fueled my determination to cut them off. I started keeping my own mental ledger, not of what I owed them, but of what they owed me in terms of basic human decency. Every time they used food as leverage, I made a note. Every time they turned heat on or off depending on whether I'd behaved, I made a note. Every time they told me I'd pay them back when they're old, I imagined myself somewhere far away, with enough money to finally slam that imaginary door shut. Graduation came, and with it, the real test. I had gotten into a community college a few towns over. Nothing fancy, but it had night classes and a work-study program. My parents assumed I'd stay home to save money, their words, not mine. But I'd been planning quietly. The summer after graduation, I picked up as many hours as I could at the grocery store, then grabbed a second job washing dishes at a diner. I barely slept, but by August, I had enough for first month's rent, a deposit, and a mattress I bought secondhand. The day I left is burned into me. I packed my clothes into garbage bags, loaded them into the back of a friend's beat-up truck, and told my parents I was moving out. My dad's face twisted in anger. "You think you're paid up? You think walking out that door clears the balance?" My mom just stood there, arms crossed, saying, "Don't come crawling back when you realize how much you owe us." I didn't answer. I just walked out. For the first time, the air outside felt like mine. That first year away was brutal. I lived on ramen, worked 2 jobs, and studied in whatever spare time I could carve out. I was constantly exhausted, constantly broke, but every morning I woke up in a crappy apartment with peeling paint and a drafty window. I reminded myself, it's mine. They can't charge me for it. And even though I was drowning in stress, I felt freer than I ever had under their roof. The hardest part was cutting contact. My mom would call, not to check in, but to remind me, don't forget, we've still got records of everything we spent on you. When you're making money someday, we'll expect payback. Sometimes my dad would leave voicemails listing random costs. Hospital bill from when you were born, 4,000. Braces, 3,000. Piano lessons you quit, 800. They recited those numbers like scripture. I'd sit there, listening, and for a while it still worked. The guilt still dug into me. But slowly, a different thought took root. What if I actually did pay them back? Exactly. To the cent. And then nothing more. That thought became the seed of my eventual revenge. But at the time, I was too busy surviving to act on it. I scraped by. I learned to live lean, to value every dime I earned. And little by little, I started to realize something they never wanted me to understand. The ledger only had power if I believed in it. By the time I turned 20, I had stopped answering most of their calls. I focused on school, on work, on building a life that was mine. I still felt their shadow over me, but it was starting to fade. And deep down, I knew, one day, I'd settle the score. Not on their terms, but on mine. My 20s were a blur of exhaustion and stubbornness. While most people I knew were figuring out what they wanted to do with their lives, I didn't have that luxury. I wasn't chasing dreams, I was chasing survival. The dream would come later. I worked jobs that chewed people up. Grocery clerk, dishwasher, delivery driver, night shift security guard. Sometimes I doubled up, working 14 to 16-hour days, catching a nap on the bus between shifts. There were weeks when the only meals I ate were free shift meals from the diner or day-old bread a friend at the bakery slipped me. It was miserable, but I clung to one thought. Every hour I worked was one more hour they didn't own. My parents called less as the months went by, but when they did, the script was always the same. When are you going to start paying us back? You think you can just leave and the debt disappears? Don't forget who gave you life. That wasn't free. For a while, I'd hang up or let it go to voicemail. But some nights, when I was bone-tired and questioning whether I could keep living like this, those words dug back in. They knew the buttons to press. Guilt, obligation, shame. It was around 22 when I finally snapped. I'd just finished a double shift at the diner. My shoes were soaked in grease, my hands raw from scouring pans. I came home, opened the mailbox, and there it was, a birthday card from my parents. Inside, instead of a note of love, or even a polite, hope you're well, my mom had written in neat blue ink. Don't forget, 22 years of food, clothing, housing, medical care. That's what you owe us. We'll expect repayment once you've got a real job. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I realized they weren't going to change. They were going to ride this debt until their last breath. And in that moment, an idea crystallized. Maybe I could repay them, but on my terms. Not a cent more, not a cent less. That's when I started collecting data. I didn't have much then, no degree, no stable career. But I had access to the internet at the library. And so I started looking up numbers. Average annual food costs for a child in the 1980s. Average clothing expenses. Average utility bills for a family of 3. Medical costs. Public school funding. I cross-referenced everything I could get my hands on. I'd sit at a computer for hours, typing notes into a Word document, building what looked like the bones of an accountant's ledger. I wasn't ready to act yet. It was more like building a weapon and locking it away for later. But even starting the process gave me a sense of control I'd never had before. For once, I was the one keeping track. I was the one deciding what counted and what didn't. Meanwhile, I kept grinding. I transferred from community college to a state university, paid for entirely by my own blood and sweat. I chose a major I knew would lead to steady work, not something glamorous, but practical, business administration. I figured if I could learn how money worked, maybe I could finally beat my parents at their own twisted game. During those years, I lived on the bare minimum. I shared a one-bedroom apartment with 2 roommates. We slept on mattresses on the floor, rotated who got to use the only decent chair, and celebrated whenever one of us could splurge on takeout. And yet, those were some of the happiest years of my life. Because for the first time, every penny I spent or saved was mine. The calls from my parents slowed down once they realized I wasn't biting. But every few months, I'd get a letter. Not warm, not personal, just lists. My dad once mailed me a handwritten invoice with line items. Hospital birth, for $1,200. Pediatric checkups, $2,500. Food for 18 years, $38,000. At the bottom, he'd scrawled, "We'll collect when you're established." I tucked the letter into a folder with my growing pile of research. Every thread, every invoice, every number they threw at me, I saved it. Not because I believed them, but because I knew, one day, it would all become useful. By 25, I'd graduated, landed an entry-level corporate job, and was pulling in more than I'd ever made before. It still wasn't much, but it was enough to pay rent without panic. It was also enough to start investing. While my coworkers blew paychecks on bars and vacations, I opened a brokerage account. I didn't know much, but I knew compound interest was my ticket out of ever being dependent again. That was also the year I decided to go no contact. Up until then, I'd kept some threadbare connection, answering a call here, a letter there. But one night, I got a voicemail from my dad, slurring after what sounded like a few drinks. "You think you can just walk away? We raised you. You exist because of us. That's not free. You'll see. One day, you'll come crawling back, begging us to forgive the debt." Something inside me snapped. I deleted the voicemail, blocked their number, and didn't look back. For years, I didn't hear from them. And for years, I didn't send them a dime. I worked, saved, got promoted. I moved into my own apartment with furniture that wasn't from the curb. I started traveling for work. Slowly, the guilt dulled. The ledger they'd carved into me was still there, etched deep, but I was learning how to overwrite it. Still, the idea of repayment haunted me. Not because I wanted to give them money, but because I wanted to kill the ledger once and for all. And the only way to do that, I realized, was to pay them exactly what they claimed, and then erase them from my life forever. By 30, I was well on my way. I'd climbed into management, built up a respectable savings, and even bought a small condo. And one night, sitting at my desk with a glass of cheap scotch, I pulled out that old folder. The invoices, the birthday card, the scribbled numbers. I spread them across the table like puzzle pieces and thought, let's finish this. That night, I started the real calculation. Not just averages, not just guesses, but line by line, year by year, cost by cost. Food, clothing, school supplies, medical bills, extracurriculars. If they'd ever mentioned an expense, I logged it. If they'd written a number, I cross-checked it with historical cost of living data. I built a spreadsheet that stretched across tabs and tabs, a meticulous reconstruction of the so-called debt. When I finally sat back and looked at the total, I laughed again. Not because it was funny, but because I realized the number wasn't astronomical. It was a finite, measurable amount. And once you can measure something, you can kill it. I closed the laptop, feeling lighter than I had in years. The plan was set. The only thing left was time. Time to grow my career, grow my bank account, and wait until the day I could pay it in full and walk away forever. And so, quietly, patiently, I prepared. My 30s were when the grind finally started to pay off. I'd spent my 20s clawing my way out of survival mode. By 30, I was no longer living paycheck to paycheck. By 32, I'd been promoted into a management position at my company. By 35, I had started my own consulting business on the side, the kind of niche operation that only made sense to people in the industry, but brought in more money than I had ever thought possible as a kid scraping plates in a diner. And here's the thing. Money didn't feel like luxury to me. It felt like armor. Every dollar in my account was another layer between me and my parents' grip, another inch of insulation from their debt. I wasn't buying sports cars or flashy watches. I was buying freedom. Around 34, I got married. My wife grew up in a normal household. Parents who loved her without strings, who didn't bring up receipts every time she asked for help. When I first told her about my upbringing, she stared at me like I was describing some dystopian novel. "They charged you for food? For existing?" she asked. I shrugged, embarrassed, like it was just a quirk of my family. She grabbed my hand and said, "That's not love. That's bookkeeping." Her words stuck with me. Not love. Bookkeeping. That's exactly what it had been. And that was the exact thing I was determined to end once and for all. By this point, my ledger project had grown into something almost obsessive. I wasn't just working with estimates anymore. I pulled actual census data from the years I'd grown up. I dug into archived grocery price indexes, average rent, even utility costs broken down by state and year. I included school supply lists, average healthcare premiums, everything I could get my hands on. Every evening after work, I'd open the spreadsheet and refine it. Line by line, cell by cell. I wasn't sloppy. I didn't round up or down carelessly. If anything, I leaned generous. If the data said a kid's food cost between $1,500 and $2,000 in 1987, I logged $2,000. If clothing averages were $300, I logged $350. If they claimed they spent money on piano lessons I barely remember, I included it. I wasn't trying to cheat them out of anything. I wanted this to be airtight, undeniable. When the day came, I wanted there to be no question that I had repaid every cent. Of course, the irony was not lost on me. They'd spent my entire childhood turning parenting into accounting, and now here I was, treating revenge like an audit. But in a way, it was poetic. They wanted a transaction? Fine. I'd give them the cleanest transaction of their lives. During this time, I heard almost nothing from them. The silence wasn't peaceful, though. It was heavy, like a storm cloud just waiting to break. Every once in a while, I'd get a stray email from my mom, usually a guilt trip disguised as a plea. Your father isn't well. You know we sacrificed everything for you. Don't you think it's time you gave back? Another one. We saw online how much consultants make. You can't possibly tell us you can't afford to help your family. I never responded. I just dragged the emails into my ledger folder and filed them away. Evidence. Proof. By 38, my consulting firm was fully mine, pulling in more than I'd ever thought I'd make. My wife and I bought a house together, a quiet, comfortable place with a big yard and a kitchen we actually enjoyed cooking in. When we signed the deed, I felt a kind of peace I'd never experienced. This wasn't my parents' house. This wasn't a place I was allowed to live in at someone else's expense. This was mine, paid for by me, and no one could tell me I owed them for it. It was around then that I decided the time had come. I'd spent years running the numbers, tweaking, double-checking. I opened the spreadsheet, ran the final calculations, and stared at the total. It wasn't small, but it wasn't impossible either. Thanks to years of saving and investing, I could cover it without jeopardizing my future. So I did what I always did when something scared me. I planned. Step 1, verify their bank account. I knew they still used the same local credit union they'd always had. A quick call to a cousin I still spoke to confirmed it. Step 2, gather the money. I liquidated a portion of a brokerage account, moved funds around, and set aside the exact amount down to the cent. Not rounded, not approximate, exact. Step 3, draft the message. That took me the longest. I wanted it to be simple, not emotional, not angry, just final. After days of overthinking, I settled on 2 words. Debt repaid. That was it. Nothing more. Step 4, prepare the cutoff. I changed my phone number, created a new email address, scrubbed my social media. I set up blocks on every platform I could think of. My wife and I had long discussions about what this meant. No contact, ever, no matter what. She supported me. They've had their hooks in you long enough, she said. It's time. I remember sitting at my desk the night I set everything up, hands hovering over the keyboard, my heart pounding like I was about to do something illegal. But what I was about to do wasn't illegal. It wasn't even cruel. It was math. Cold, precise math. When I clicked transfer, I felt something shift, like shackles slipping off, like the air got lighter. Years of guilt, of imagined invoices, of hearing "you owe us" in my head. It all went silent. The money was gone from my account, sure, but for the first time, the ledger was empty, balanced, zeroed out. And just like that, so were they. The next morning, I woke up to a new life. No debt, no hooks, no more bookkeeping, just freedom. The morning after I clicked transfer, I woke up earlier than usual. No alarm, no rushing to get somewhere. Just awake. For a second, I didn't even remember why my chest felt so light. Then it hit me. It was done. I had paid them back. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared out at the yard. My wife came in bleary-eyed and asked, "Well, how do you feel?" I thought about it. Free, I said, and I meant it. Of course, the silence didn't last long. Around noon that same day, my old email, still technically active but set to forward into a dead folder, pinged with messages. I didn't open them, but I could see the subject lines in the preview. What is this supposed to mean? We didn't raise you to be this cold. This isn't enough. I deleted them without reading, but a part of me couldn't help imagining their faces when they saw the bank notification. I pictured my mom opening her online account, seeing that lump sum drop in, and realizing what the memo said, debt repaid. I pictured my dad's reaction too. I could almost hear his voice, somewhere between rage and disbelief. That's not how this works. He doesn't get to decide when the debt is paid. But that was exactly the point. They'd spent my entire life pretending they were the ones with the power. That ledger in the kitchen drawer, those birthday reminders, the drunken voicemails, it had all been about control. And with one transfer, I'd taken that control away. By the end of the week, the emails had escalated. I didn't read them fully, but the previews were enough. This is insulting. You can't just cut us off like we're strangers. We'll never forgive this. And my personal favorite, you owe us more than money. You owe us respect. That one almost made me laugh. Respect? That had been spent long before I was old enough to earn a paycheck. Then came the phone calls. Somehow, despite changing numbers, they managed to get through once or twice. Maybe through relatives, maybe through sheer persistence. The voicemails were long, rambling, alternating between anger and pity. My mom crying, saying, "How could you reduce everything we did to a number? Parenting isn't about money." Then my dad yelling, "You think this settles it? You'll regret this when we're gone." The irony of hearing them suddenly claim parenting wasn't about money nearly broke me. After decades of invoices and ledgers and guilt trips, now they wanted to rewrite history. But I didn't respond. Not once. Every message went into the folder. Every voicemail got deleted after I copied it into a log. I wasn't keeping the records for them anymore. I was keeping them for me. Proof that I'd done exactly what they asked, and that they still couldn't let go of their control. The hardest part wasn't ignoring them. The hardest part was ignoring the little boy inside me who still wanted their approval, who still thought maybe, just maybe, if I gave enough, they'd finally love me without conditions. That part of me stirred when I saw the angry emails, whispering, maybe you should explain. Maybe if they understood, they'd finally be proud. But then I remembered that birthday card, that invoice, that time I was sick on the couch and my dad told me I owed him for a $12 bottle of medicine. And I shut that voice down. I didn't know them explanations. I didn't know them forgiveness. I didn't know them anything. Over the next few weeks, the noise slowed down. Fewer emails, fewer calls. Either they were getting the message, or they were running out of ways to twist the knife. For the first time in my life, their voices weren't in my head 24/7. The silence was strange, but it was a good strange. Like stepping out of a factory after years of machinery pounding in your ears. I started noticing little things. I'd go to the grocery store and buy whatever I wanted without hearing, "Do you know how much that costs?" in my head. I'd leave a light on in the kitchen and not feel a pang of guilt about the electric bill. I'd eat a meal and not think of it as an item on a ledger. I hadn't realized how deep their conditioning went until it started to fade. One night, maybe a month later, I sat down at my desk, opened the spreadsheet one last time, and stared at that final number. I traced the columns, the rows, the notes I'd left myself. And for the first time, instead of feeling dread, I felt satisfaction. I closed the file, moved it into a completed folder, and backed it up to an external drive I'll probably never touch again. When I shut the laptop, I felt something I can only describe as closure. Not the Hollywood kind, with dramatic confrontations or tearful reconciliations. Just calm, a quiet certainty that the chapter was closed, and nothing they did or said could reopen it. My wife asked me that night if I felt guilty. I told her the truth, no. Because here's the thing, paying them wasn't about giving them what they deserved. It was about giving me what I deserved, peace. And I'd finally found it. In the months after the transfer, I noticed something strange. My life didn't look all that different from the outside. Same house, same work, same routines. But inside, everything felt different. It was like walking around without a backpack I hadn't realized I was wearing. For decades, I'd been carrying this invisible weight. Every meal, every light switch, every pair of shoes turned into a running tally of what I owed. And now, suddenly, it was gone. I caught myself testing the freedom in little ways. At the grocery store, I put steak in the cart without guilt. I filled the cart with name-brand cereal instead of generic. And when the cashier told me the total, I didn't flinch. I just paid, smiled, and went home. One night, I left every single light on in the house for no reason at all. Kitchen, living room, hallway, bathroom. I just sat there on the couch, bathed in a glow that would have made my dad furious. I imagined him barking, "Do you think electricity is free?" And for the first time in my life, I could answer, even if only in my head, yes. For me, it is now. The freedom wasn't just about money. It was about time, too. I realized I no longer had to live my life in response to them. My goals weren't shaped around proving something or paying something off. I wasn't chasing some invisible approval. I could finally choose things just because I wanted them. At work, that meant saying yes to projects that excited me instead of ones that promised prestige. At home, it meant spending lazy Sundays in the yard, planting tomatoes with my wife, because it made us happy. No ROI, no ledger entry. Just living. The contact from my parents eventually stopped altogether. No more emails, no more voicemails. At first, I wondered if they'd given up, or if they were plotting some dramatic reappearance. But as weeks turned into months, and months into years, I realized it didn't matter. Whether they seethed in silence or tried to rewrite history, it was no longer my problem. Every once in a while, I'd hear bits through extended family. A cousin mentioned my mom complaining that I'd insulted them with the money, that I'd made them feel like landlords instead of parents. Another time, someone said my dad called me ungrateful at a family barbecue. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just nodded, changed the subject, and went on with my life. Because the truth is, their version of the story doesn't matter anymore. They can tell anyone who'll listen that I'm ungrateful, cold, disrespectful. Let them. The people who know me, the ones who see the life I've built, the marriage I've nurtured, the work I've poured myself into, know the truth. And more importantly, I know the truth. There's a specific kind of peace in realizing you don't need the last word. For most of my life, I dreamed of a confrontation where I'd lay everything out. Every memory, every hurt, every time they said, "You owe us." I wanted them to understand, to finally see the damage they'd done. But after the transfer, I realized that would have been pointless. They weren't capable of understanding, and I wasn't responsible for making them. Instead, I gave them exactly what they demanded, and nothing more. That was the last word. By 40, my consulting firm had grown enough that I could step back from day-to-day work. I wasn't rich, but I was secure. My wife and I traveled, explored cities and countries I'd only ever read about as a kid. And every time I walked through an airport or sat in a cafe overseas, I thought about how far I'd come from that kitchen table where my mom warned me not to waste spaghetti because it cost money. One night in Paris, sitting across from my wife with a glass of wine, I told her something I'd never admitted out loud. I don't think I ever believed I'd actually get here. Not really. She reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and said, "That's because they wanted you to believe you never would." She was right. That was the cruelest part of their system. Not just the ledger itself, but the way it made me think I'd never escape it. That no matter how far I went, I'd always be in debt to them. But sitting there, free in every sense of the word, I knew I had escaped. Even my body felt it. The anxiety that used to keep me up at night, the tension in my shoulders, the knot in my stomach whenever money came up, it all loosened. For the first time since I could remember, I slept deeply, without dreams of being chased by invoices or demands. Sometimes I think about kids who are growing up like I did. Kids who are told that existing is a debt, that love has a price tag. I want to find them, sit them down, and tell them, it's a lie. You don't owe anyone for being alive. I don't, though. I don't post under my real name. Don't go hunting for some big public platform. I'm not trying to turn my story into a crusade. But every now and then, when I see someone online talking about parents who hold expenses over their heads, I feel that old burn in my chest. And I remember why I'm writing this now. Because maybe someone like that will read this and realize there's another way. That love isn't a transaction, and freedom doesn't come from paying endless debts. It comes from refusing to play the game anymore. And for me, that refusal wasn't just walking away. It was walking away with the balance sheet cleared. Not because they deserved it, but because I did. I'm 42 now. When I look at my life today, it doesn't resemble the one my parents told me I'd have. They used to say I'd crawl back, one day, desperate, begging for forgiveness and support. Instead, I wake up in a house I own, with a partner who loves me without strings, and a career I built brick by brick. There's no crawling back. There's no ledger hanging over my head. There's just me living. Sometimes, though, I catch myself replaying old moments. My mom's voice telling me not to waste food because it costs money. My dad demanding I remember the hospital bill from my birth. The notebooks with scribbles in the kitchen drawer, pretending to keep track of my debt. They used those things to keep me small, to keep me obedient. And for years, it worked. But here's the truth I've learned after paying it all back and cutting them off. Love doesn't come with receipts. Parenting isn't a loan. A child isn't born into debt. I spent a long time thinking closure would come from some grand confrontation. I imagined myself standing in front of them, laying out every cruel thing they ever said, every manipulation, every tally mark in their mental ledger. I thought maybe if I shouted it loudly enough, they'd break down and finally admit what they'd done. But that's not how it works. People like them don't suddenly wake up and realize they were wrong. They don't apologize. They double down. They twist. They rewrite history. If I had gone to them demanding acknowledgement, I'd still be waiting. Instead, I gave them what they'd always asked for. Not love, not connection, not respect. Just money. The exact sum of what they claimed to have spent raising me. No more. No less. And then I walked away. And walking away, finally, was the real revenge. Because here's what they can never take back. They taught me to live my life like a debtor. They taught me to calculate, to plan, to account for every cent. And I used those exact lessons against them. Their own system became the weapon that freed me. That's the irony that makes me smile now when I think about it. They believed they were shaping me into someone who would serve them forever, someone who'd spend his adult life chained to their bills. Instead, they shaped me into someone who knew how to grind, how to save, how to build something from nothing. Someone who could calculate their debt with surgical precision, pay it off, and then vanish without regret. If they had given me unconditional love, I might have stayed. I might have wanted to be close to them as they aged, to share my successes, to let them meet my wife and celebrate our milestones. But they didn't. They chose bookkeeping over love. And so I closed the books. These days, I don't feel anger anymore. I don't feel guilt, either. What I feel is calm. The kind of calm that comes from knowing the fight is over. From knowing I don't owe them a thing. I think back sometimes to that younger version of me. The kid holding a plate of spaghetti, terrified of wasting a bite. The teenager handing over his first paycheck and being told it was a drop in the bucket. The college student opening a birthday card with a reminder of his debt. If I could talk to him now, I'd tell him, hold on. It's going to hurt. But one day, you're going to pay them back on your terms. And then you'll be free. And that freedom will taste better than any apology. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe one day I'll hear they've passed away. Maybe I'll get another stray email or voicemail trying to reopen the ledger. But it won't matter. Because the debt is settled in every sense. The last time I logged into my bank account after sending that transfer, I remember staring at the confirmation message. Transaction successful. It felt like more than money moving. It felt like years of shame draining out of me. Like I'd finally turned off a machine that had been grinding inside my chest since I was a kid. I've never turned it back on. Now, when I walk through my house, I see light in every room. I open the fridge and don't think about the price of the groceries inside. I put on a jacket without worrying about keeping it perfect for fear of wasting their money. Those little things might sound small, but for me, they're proof. Proof that I am free, that love is not a transaction, and that my life belongs to me. So here it is, my story laid bare. I repaid my parents exactly what they demanded, and then I erased them from my life. I don't tell this to brag. I tell it because for years, I thought I'd never escape. I thought I'd always be living under their roof in my head, paying rent forever. But I'm not. Not anymore. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's not shouting, or fighting, or even forgiving. Sometimes it's as simple as giving people exactly what they demanded, and nothing more. And then living the rest of your life in peace. Debt repaid. Chapter closed.